Last summer, I decided to take a weekend trip to a small town a few hours away. I found a cute little cottage on Airbnb that seemed perfect. I found a little cottage on Airbnb that seemed perfect. Rustic charm, secluded, and reasonably priced. The photos looked great and the reviews were all positive, so I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, the place looked exactly like the pictures. It was nestled in the woods with a cozy porch and big windows. The host had left the key under the doormat just like they said they would. I let myself in and immediately felt at home. There was a welcoming note on the kitchen table with a list of local attractions and a bottle of wine. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening reading on the porch and enjoying the peace and quiet. It was a nice change from the city noise I was used to. But as I got ready for bed, I started noticing odd things. The first thing was a strange smell in the bathroom. It was faint, like something damp and musty, but I brushed it off as an old house quirk. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint, creaking sound. It was coming from above me. I lay there, listening, as the creaking turned into soft footsteps. It sounded like someone was walking around in the attic. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or a raccoon that had found its way inside. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to the host via the Airbnb app. They replied quickly, assuring me that it was probably just the wind or the old wood shifting. I wanted to believe them, so I shrugged it off and went about my day exploring the town. That night, the footsteps started again, this time a bit louder and more deliberate. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and decided to check out the attic. The entrance was a small hatch in the hallway ceiling with a pull-down ladder. My heart was racing as I pulled it down and climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture and boxes. I waved the flashlight around but didn't see anything unusual until I noticed a small door on the far wall. It was half hidden behind some old trunks and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I moved the trunks aside and opened the door. Inside was a tiny, dark room with a single, ancient-looking rocking chair. The air was thick and musty, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I quickly backed out and closed the door, my mind racing with questions. Who used that room? Why was it hidden? I went back downstairs and tried to sleep, but the footsteps started again, louder and more insistent. It sounded like they were right above me, pacing back and forth. I lay there, frozen, until the noise finally stopped just before dawn. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed up my things and left the key on the kitchen table. As I was about to drive away, I received a message from the host. I hope you enjoyed your stay. Please make sure to lock the attic door before you leave. I hadn't mentioned the attic to them, and the realization sent a chill down my spine. I sped away, not looking back, and left a polite but vague review. I still think about that hidden room and the footsteps in the night. I'll never know what was in the attic or why the host knew about it, but I've been much more careful about where I stay since then. A couple of months ago, I booked a weekend getaway at an Airbnb in a remote mountain village. It was a charming old cabin with stunning views and a promise of total seclusion. The pictures looked inviting and the host had glowing views. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The drive was beautiful, but the closer I got, the more isolated I felt. The last stretch of road was a narrow winding path through the dense forest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost dark. The cabin itself was as quaint as advertised. It had a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a small but functional kitchen, and a loft bedroom. The host had left a welcome note along with a few local snacks and a list of recommended hikes and activities. After settling in, I made myself dinner and decided to relax by the fire. As I was unpacking my things, I found a handwritten note tucked into one of the drawers. It simply said, "Don't go out after dark." I laughed it off, thinking it was probably a joke left by a previous guest. The first night, I slept soundly, but the next day, things started to get weird. I spent most of the day hiking and taking photos, enjoying the fresh mountain air. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I cautiously stepped inside and looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I locked the door again, double checking it this time, and settled in for another quiet night. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from the kitchen. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and tiptoed downstairs. The kitchen was dark, but I could see that one of the cabinet doors was open, and a jar of pasta sauce lay shattered on the floor. I cleaned up the mess, trying to convince myself that it was just a poorly placed jar that had fallen. But then I heard it again, a soft, persistent tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the window. I shined my flashlight towards the sound, but there was nothing there, just a dark forest outside. I decided to go back to bed, hoping to sleep through the rest of the night. But as soon as I turned off the flashlight, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. My blood ran cold as I listened, too scared to move. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing by each window and then stopping at the front door. There was a long, terrifying silence, then a soft knock on the door. I held my breath, praying whoever it was would just go away. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I finally worked up the courage to peek through the small window next to the door. There was no one there. The knocking had stopped. I was about to turn away when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the tree line. It was tall and motionless, watching the cabin. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and my bag and quietly made my way to the back door. I slipped outside and ran to my car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I called the host from a payphone, but there was no answer. I left a message explaining what happened and drove straight home, cutting my trip short. A few days later, I received a response from the host. They apologized and said no one else had reported anything unusual. They offered me a refund and a free stay if I ever wanted to come back. I politely declined. There was no way I was ever going back to that cabin. To this day, I still wonder who or what was watching me that night. I've stayed in many Airbnbs since then, but I've never felt completely at ease. Last fall, I decided to treat myself to a quiet weekend getaway and booked an Airbnb in a small town I'd never been to before. The place was an old farmhouse, advertised as charming and secluded, perfect for a peaceful retreat. The host, Mark, had great reviews and everything seemed legit. I arrived late in the afternoon and the farmhouse was as picturesque as the photos had shown. It sat at the long end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods. Mark had left the key under the mat and a note on the kitchen table welcoming me and suggesting some local spots to visit. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, watched a movie, and then went to bed. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound coming from outside. It was a rhythmic creaking, like an old swing, moving back and forth. I figured it was just the wind and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound kept me up for hours. The next morning, I explored the property. There was an old barn a little way off from the house, and I found the source of the creaking, a rusty swing set, moving gently in the breeze. It was eerie, but I brushed it off and spent the day hiking and taking photos. That evening, as I was cooking dinner, I heard footsteps on the porch. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. I opened the door and found a small, crudely made doll sitting on the welcome mat. It was made of twigs and cloth, with a creepy stitched-on smile. I figured it was a prank by some local kids and tossed it aside. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the creaking again. This time, it was coming from the front porch. I grabbed the flashlight and went to check, but there was nothing there. Just the doll, now sitting in the middle of the porch, facing the door. My heart started to race. I picked up the doll and threw it into the woods, hoping that would be the end of it. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard faint whispers outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing but darkness. The final night, things took a terrifying turn. I woke up to the sounds of footsteps inside the house. They were slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. I locked the bedroom door and dialed Mark's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I heard a soft, raspy whisper, "Come out and play." I was shaking with fear, clutching my phone, trying to think of what to do. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. I heard the front door creak open and then slam shut. Gathering all my courage, I bolted out of the house, jumping into my car, and sped down the driveway without looking back. I drove straight to the nearest town and checked in at a motel. The next morning, I called Mark again and he sounded genuinely concerned. He said no one else had ever reported anything strange and offered me a full refund. A few days later, I received an email from Mark with an attached photo. It was of the doll, back on the porch of the farmhouse. He asked if I had left it there as a joke. I never replied. To this day, I don't know what happened at that farmhouse. I've stayed in many Airbnbs since, but I always make sure they're in busy, well-lit areas.